Upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop, and you've got to indicate to the people who run it and the people who own it that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it.
Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me.
Revolution Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
On the go? Still want to listen? Don't have one of those fancy phones with too many buttons. Don't know what an app is? Or you don't even care? Well, we got you here at Revolution Radio. Now you can dial in 24/7 to listen to our shows. We have a number for Studio A and Studio B, and best of all, it's free. Don't forget, your carrier charges for your cell phone provider may apply, though, so check with your cell provider to make sure. So ready? Here you go. Get a pen. Here's the number. Studio A is 712-432-6958, and Studio B is 716-748-0112. Thank you very much for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station in the world.
Rebecca Jernigan, your tour guide into discoveries, coming to you live from the heart of America to around the globe via the World Wide Web, satellite, and podcast. Let's journey together of the known to the unknown in search of enlightenment, knowledge, and truth.
Fellas?
Stand by, Nick. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet Earth. This is your host, Rebecca Jernigan, and you are listening to Journeys with Rebecca right here on wolfspiritradio.com, and also being heard at Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, Studio B. Please remember that donations for both Wolf Spirit Radio and Freedom Slips are really needed and always in gratitude. So those donations really do help make a difference. It allows for all of the hosts and also the stations to continue with all of the good work. Please don't forget to go to my website, that's journeyswithrebecca.com, and check out the archives, any upcoming guests and topics, classes and workshops, as well as setting an appointment for your session. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter, as well as the YouTube and my Twitter channel, all right there from the front page of Journeys with Rebecca. Joining me tonight is my engineer and producer and good friend JP, as well as Tobias is with us as well. And I have a fabulous guest, a return guest who almost doesn't need an introduction because he's been on frequently on the show. He's one of my favorite people in the whole world, if that's actually a word. My wonderful return guest tonight is Nick Redfern. The book tonight that we're going to be talking about is the last, I believe is the last in the trilogy, called Immortality of the Gods, Legends, Mysteries, and the Alien Connection to Eternal Life. Each of us are alive for a very limited time, or are we? What if we could live not just for a century, but for a millennia? What if there was a way for us to never die? Is such a thing even remotely possible? It may not only be feasible, it may very well have been achieved in the distant past. Ancient aliens may well have uncovered the secrets behind slowing and ultimately completely stopping the aging process. History is filled with accounts of fantastic beings, powerful gods, and half-human, half-alien entities that had extraordinarily long lifespans. Many such stories are now largely dismissed as nothing more than the stuff of legend, folklore, and mythology. But what if the accounts are all too real? The story of the legendary Anunnaki, how they achieved everlasting life, and why they shared their secrets with Noah, Methuselah, and other biblical figures. The saga of Gilgamesh, a long-lived, part human, part extraterrestrial Sumerian ruler who was obsessed with immortality. And a study in the claims that one of the reasons for the 2003 invasion of Iraq was to uncover the millennia-old secrets of white powder gold, a mana-like substance that supposedly rejuvenates cells and tissues. Tonight, Nick is here with us. This, again, is a trilogy. He was on talking to us about the bloodline of the gods and also weapons of the gods. And now we have him here with us tonight. And we're very grateful to have him. And I want to welcome him to the show. Hi, Nick. How are you tonight?
Hey, Rebecca. I'm doing good, thanks.
Are you still in Texas?
Yeah, I'm still here. I've been here 17 years. So. I live just outside Dallas.
Okay, yeah, I was just more concerned with the weather there and how everyone was doing, and that's why I checked with you.
Yeah, fortunately, everything's okay here, although I do, several friends of mine, they've got friends who sort of caught, sort of major amount of the flooding down there, but where I am in Dallas, fortunately, it's sort of much further north, and we have had the last couple of days quite a lot of rain, but nothing that you would call storms, so we've kind of just got, the ripples of it, I guess. But down in Houston particularly, I mean, they've got it really bad,
Well, I'm grateful that you're actually able to make it and that you weren't in the worst part of it. And all of us I know from both of the stations we're on, as well as many people all around the globe, have been putting out their prayers and good thoughts for all the people in Texas and wherever the storm, that hurricane is hitting. So we want to take a moment there and just recognize that. And so we are grateful that you're able to be with us tonight. So,
well, thanks.
Yeah, really, I am very grateful, honestly, not just because it's the show, but because I was like, wow, I thought that's might be where you were at. And I was like, well, I just hope that he's okay. We don't want everyone to see anybody we know certainly, get harmed in harm's way in any way whatsoever. What I'd like to start out with here tonight, Nick, is you have just written a ton of books, and I just want to say this to you before I have you get into your information. Is I read this book, and you are a great writer. There is just no doubt about it in my mind. You tell you put together facts. It always flows. Your books always flow. The information always flows. But I have to say, far and beyond, out of all the books that I've read that you have written, and I haven't read them all, this has been my favorite. I almost couldn't put it down. It was just almost riveting. It was just fabulous the way you put this together. Some kind of sink or flow kicked in there, Nick, and it was just fabulous. So thank you for writing the book.
I appreciate that, Rebecca. Thank you. I mean, whenever I'm writing a book, it's not just sort of important enough to obviously get the facts over, but also to make a book readable. You can get up all the facts, but if it reads like a dictionary, people are just going to sort of roll their eyes and fall asleep, which is what I would do as well. So, it's always important to make a book entertaining and readable as well as, informative.
Well, and you've done that here. You've made it extremely informative, very readable, and again, like I said, very riveting. So how many books does this make for you that you've actually published, that you've actually had published now?
I think published is about 42, 43, and I'm always sort of working on about another 3 or 4. I've got one actually coming out next month called Shapeshifters, which is all sort of strange creatures. And then in January of next year, I've got one on the whole Slender Man controversy coming out.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so can we have you back on then in a couple of months when your next book comes out?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's no problem at all.
I'm hoping anyway. So, I think that maybe a little bit of history here, because we always kind of bypass that and I always kind of get right into the meat of everything. But maybe a little bit of history here. You're a ufologist. Isn't that kind of what you kind of have been kind of pegged, and also a cryptozoologist?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to, the world of the paranormal, but my two sort of big interests are cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, and the other one being the UFO subject. I don't do much sort of ghost stuff because it's just not really my area of interest. So, it's better to leave that to the experts in those fields, So, but for me, sort of cryptozoology and ufology, that's enough on my plate already. So, without adding something else.
That's a whole nother lifetime. I mean, you could, and talk about immortality. Maybe that's what you need to do in order to write all this information down, right? It's huge topics. Especially when we get into the whole, ancient alien extraterrestrial thing, my feeling is that some of these, unusual creatures, could have either been vestiges of, leftover times of before that we just haven't discovered. They're, other dimensional beings. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could look at some of these kind of, what we call the mythological, which I don't believe that all of them are creatures, such as Loch Ness and Bigfoot, et cetera, and so forth. There's got to be something to them, whether it's been totally misconstrued or not. There's got to be something to the basis of all this. And so that's what's fascinating to me is to look at all these different topics and go, wow, okay, so, you get all this stuff going on. It's not all fantasy world for sure, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you look at Loch Ness, I mean, there's clearly a phenomenon. Now, there are all sorts of different theories. Some people think they're surviving reptiles from the Jurassic period called plesiosaurs. Other people think they're giant eels. Funnily enough, and weirdly enough, there's actually a lot of paranormal stuff surrounding Loch Ness as well. I actually wrote a book on that last year called Nessie, which looked at all the sort of supernatural aspects to the mystery as well. And it's kind of like with Bigfoot. Some researchers think Bigfoot is a relic population of a huge ancient ape that lived about 200,000 years ago called Gigantopithecus, which was sort of like a gorilla, but much, much larger. Now, Bigfoot sort of walks more like a human, so I'm not personally convinced that's the answer, but it's an interesting possibility. So with a lot of these stories, you can make a case sometimes that they could be supernatural. On other occasions, some of them I'm sure are, unknown animals that we just haven't found yet. And so, for me, the goal is to sort of keep digging and keep going on expeditions and trying to one day hopefully get the answers.
That would be nice if we could ever find out the real deal on it, and I guess that's where we're, we got information, just coming out our ears on all of these different topics. And it's like at some point, some of it has got to start flowing and making, some real sense and to all of us. I mean, because like I said, I just don't believe that all of these things that we have heard about, read about, and they've talked about for centuries and centuries, maybe millennia, can all be myths or fantasy. I just can't. I just can't imagine that.
One of the important things is you often find with any kind of myth or legend or folklore, there's always usually some basis in reality, even if the myth has been distorted over time. There's something to it. I mean, if you look back at Native American legends of Bigfoot, way before the term Bigfoot was created in the 1950s, you can go back and look at newspapers from the 1800s, where obviously the term Bigfoot wasn't in use, but they had stories of hairy wild men and stories of them going back sort of the 17th and 16th centuries, with the Native Americans, and talking about these things, and the people of the day saying, "Oh, it's just myth," But we're still seeing these things today. So, in other words, things that are sort of perceived as folklore, as I said, typically do have some basis in reality. It's just a matter of trying to figure out where the truth begins, so to speak, and where it's got distorted, you know, with sort of friend of a friend tales and things like that over the centuries, you know.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So I'm gonna switch back here to gears and talk about your latest book, The Immortality of the Gods. You know, I have to tell you, I had you on for the first two, which was the bloodline and the weapons. And, you know, it's like, I don't know, it's like, they're all involved with kind of the same thing, even though they're very specific, right? There's a separation into the topics, but yet they are all intertwined, you know? It's like really getting down into the layers of the cake, so to speak, and you're getting way down in it and you're going, okay. So then you kind of put the whole thing together, all three of these, and it seems like it's all steeping or coming from similar directions. Would you agree with that, or is that what you found during your research?
Yeah, I mean, when I made an agreement with the publisher, New Page, to do these books, you know, I mean, in theory, I could have written a bunch of the gods type books forever, you know. But the problem is, well, that's what's the problem, but the thing is that, you know, so many books have been written on ancient astronauts that it's difficult to come up with new ideas. So what I didn't want to do was go over a bunch of old ground and, you know, just essentially just copy what other people have written. And I felt that the best thing to do was just to keep it as a trilogy, because there were three subjects I knew which hadn't really been covered to any great extent at all, and then move on. You know, I think sometimes that's a good way to do it, is, you know, not hang around like, you know, your favourite band who's 70 years old and they really should have stopped playing 30 years ago, you know, that kind of thing. I didn't want to be in a position where, you know, when I'm one day 70, that people say, well, he's just recycling a bunch of the gods books. I didn't want to be in that position. So I felt that doing three, the first one, Bloodline of the Gods, for people who may not know, was a study of people who have Rh negative blood and who have a very high incidence of UFO encounters, and it sort of goes back to sort of genetic manipulation of early humans like Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man. And then Weapons of the Gods was a look at whether or not there was ancient nuclear war in the distant past, looking at stories like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, which also talks about what sounds eerily like an ancient nuclear war. And then the new one, Immortality of the Gods, which sort of rounds it all off, for me at least, is a study of why is it that, you know, throughout all cultures and countries and people who've never met each other, they all have these tales of immortal gods, and all these immortal gods have to ingest certain substances to keep them young and so they don't age or die. So then he takes the view, or were they gods, or were they visiting extraterrestrials who'd actually developed a science and a technology that allowed them to slow down or even bring to a halt the aging process?
And that's an actually excellent way to start, because your first chapter deals with the longest lived aliens of all. So why don't you kind of start there and let's just kind of flow through that. And before I forget, I want to let people know that if you have questions for Nick, we're going to hold them off until the second hour, but please place all of your questions in the chat room in all caps so that we can open up the chat back and forth later on in the show and ask those questions of Nick in regards to this book and Immortality of the Gods. So let's start with the longest lived of them all. Let's kind of give them a timeline here of this, because it goes in some of the history that all of us have kind of grown up with, as well as that which we have not.
Okay. Well, this basically deals with what are known, excuse me, as the Anunnaki. Now, the Anunnaki, although they were sort of championed and highlighted a great deal by the late Zecharia Sitchin over the last sort of 20 years or thereabouts before his death, a lot of people assumed that the story of the Anunnaki was a relatively new one, but it actually wasn't. The legends and the lore and the beliefs of the Anunnaki date back literally thousands and thousands of years BC, and they reportedly were sort of the people of Mesopotamia at the time, which today is called the Tigris-Euphrates River system. Back then, the Anunnaki were their gods in the way that today people perceive them as ancient extraterrestrials. But they reportedly brought sort of civilization to the people and to that era, and taught them in the ways of like farming and agriculture and building, that kind of thing. But they weren't seen as, just highly advanced people from another nation overseas. They were sort of definitive supernatural deities, if you like. But certainly in the last 2 decades or thereabouts, the whole issue of the Anunnaki being aliens and coming to the Earth and genetically sort of manipulating the human race and altering our DNA, so to speak. And in terms of Zecharia Sitchin, he believed that they came here to create a slave race. So they, according to his views, they sort of genetically altered an early human and kind of upgraded them so they would be the ultimate worker slave, so to speak, and that they had bases on the Earth and interacted with the people. And they may have been even, as Sitchin suggested, the idea that when you find these stories from the Bible and other ancient religious accounts of the gods coming down, the giants coming down, and creating offspring with human women, and you have these human-like giants. That was one of the theories with the Anunnaki, that they were able to reproduce with us, and it led to the creation of what are known as demigods, or in today's terminology, the idea of like a half-human, half-alien crossbreed, which may also have been responsible for some of the other stories of random giants in the Bible, like Goliath. He could have been, a multi-generation down the line, but having that original lineage. So the Anunnaki really have come to define many of the stories about ancient astronauts. And one of the things about them was that they reportedly had these incredible lifespans. And researchers have suggested anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 years, which, if that's true, that would be incredible, compared to 80 or 90 years. It would be almost impossible to envisage it. So that's why I start with the Anunnaki, because they're sort of really at the forefront of all this.
So, Zecharia Sitchin was some of the first works that I read, Nick, early on, about that. Some of his earlier works were kind of tough to get through, but,
yeah.
But, it was really an eye-opening thing. I mean, when you're questing and seeking, you find these different books that come out, and for some reason they just, fall into your lap more or less, and it starts to open up a world, and it answers some questions, and of course it opens up others. And, I've heard the whole idea behind the Anunnaki, living 200,000 years, and, some people say that we're still being influenced by them. Well, if we're part of the bloodline, that would stand for some of the influences. So in regards to all that and the slave race, I remember in Zecharia Sitchin's, one of his books, where he showed, them mining for gold.
Yeah.
And he had created this slave race. And then it gets into this whole thing about the Garden of Eden. The reason why that that Eve supposedly ate the apple was and they realized then that they could reproduce because they knew how to do that or something. And he tied that into the Garden of Eden somewhere, and the whole story behind Adam and Eve, and it just got kind of a little convoluted there. So I'm going to kind of ask you if you have some clarity on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, Sitchin took the idea, as many ancient astronaut researchers do, the idea that parts of the story that we find in ancient texts are true, but over time they've been sort of simplified and distorted. Now, if you look at, for example, the story of Adam and Eve. Now, in the Bible, they're presented as two people, a man and a woman. Now, in terms of Sitchin's work, he came to conclude, from deciphering the old text and having people interpret them for him, he came to believe or accept that the early humans were referred to by the Anunnaki as the Adama, A-D-M-A-A or A-D-A-M-U, depending on whose version you accept. So in other words, he believed that the Adama or the Adamu were, in essence, early humans, not just one man or one woman. It was the male and the female of these early sort of proto-altered people. Now, it is interesting if you look in the Bible. The literal story is that Eve was fashioned out of one of Adam's ribs, and that when that happened, the Bible also states that Adam was put into like a deep state of sleepness. Now that sounds very much like he was anaesthetized, as if you're going in a hospital for surgery. He was briefly knocked out. And from there, actually taking, Adam's rib, you literally could not, create another person out of somebody's rib. That's just ridiculous. But what you could potentially do is to take cells and actually embark on the cloning process. So that was one of the things that Sitchin talked about as well, the idea of the people of that era getting the basics but not understanding the science and technology, and so it became more of a story, like a supernatural, magical type story, rather than one based around extraterrestrial science. Now, I know that maybe some people listening would find it outrageous to suggest that, the story of the Garden of Eden and the birth of Adam and Eve was due to extraterrestrials, but it really depends on which way you kind of look at it. Are we talking about God putting Adam to sleep and creating Eve out of his rib, or are we talking about the Anunnaki anaesthetizing Adam and taking cells for a cloning process? If you look at it like that, there's not much difference. It's just the science and technology that pushes one down one path, and the lack of the science in the other angle pushes it down the other path.
Yeah, and the end result is still the same.
Yeah, the end result is that there's this race of people called the human race. But whichever way you look at it, it comes down to the fact that we, as we are today, Homo sapien, were created by something beyond our understanding and far more, powerful and possibly even supernatural than us.
Absolutely, I agree. So let's get back to Zecharia Sitchin's and his whole idea, because it kind of leads into the next chapter of your book, where he was talking about that the Anunnaki made a race of beings. And to me, honestly, when I look back at what I read, not understanding science in those days, not ever hearing the term cloning or DNA or any of that stuff back in, I think that book was in the 70s or 80s. I think that's what he was actually talking about, is like, cloned or grown, kind of a slave race to mine the gold. And there's a lot of stuff that's gone on around the gold and also silver. So maybe you can talk about that as it relates to your book and the contents of it.
Well, yeah. I mean, as far as the Anunnaki is concerned, researchers like the late Lawrence Gardner and Zecharia Sitchin came to two conclusions. One was that the Anunnaki used this slave race to mine for the Earth's gold. Now, the reason being, supposedly, was that their home planet, the atmosphere, was degrading significantly, and they were going to use literally sort of billions of tons of gold dust to plug the holes in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, to a lot of people, that might sound like sci-fi, but back in the 1970s, there was a research team which worked under Dr. Edward Teller, and the plan was, if our ozone layer degraded even more and more, the plan was that we could literally sort of flood the upper atmosphere with, again, sort of billions of tons of dust, metallic dust, to essentially help plug the holes and block the the gap in the atmosphere. So there's nothing particularly new or strange about it. And, so the idea that the Anunnaki may have needed to that is not impossible. And it is something, as I said, that in the 70s we looked at as well. Now, there was also reportedly another reason why gold was so important to the Anunnaki, and this sort of delves into the area of things like alchemy, of changing the literal sort of cellular state of atoms and how they interact. And reportedly, they created what was known as white powder gold, which was a very refined sort of alchemical cocktail, almost, is probably the best way to describe it, which, if ingested, could have significant beneficial effects on the human body in terms of, again, slowing down the aging process, bringing it to a halt, rejuvenation, not sort of, making you younger again, nothing like that, but actually slowing things down to ensure that you live much longer than normal. So in other words, the Anunnaki may not naturally have lived for massive amounts of time. They may have achieved it in the same way that perhaps we will one day. Perhaps one day, 200 years from now, people will look back and say those poor old people in the 21st century only lived to 90 years and we lived to 10,000, It's not impossible that could be the scenario. So the whole issue of gold, but not just gold, but also other mysterious cocktails, like, for example, the ancient Greek gods, they had ambrosia. The ancient gods of India, they had amrita. And then in the Bible, you have this mysterious substance which didn't prevent aging, but it did keep the Israelites, fed and, well nourished for 40 years, which was known as manna, which fell down from the sky, interestingly enough. So, again, all around the world, you can find these legends of these supernatural, powerful beings that lived massively extended lifespans, but to do so, they had to constantly keep taking these sort of, as I said, these mysterious cocktails.
That's always been a place of curiosity for me, Nick, is this mana. And, nowhere have I read anything that gives a hint or an inclination as to what this actually was that was sprinkled from the heavens just in that area for the Israelites, just for them. It's not like it was a global thing, right? So it's like...
Oh, no, you're right. You're right. But, the whole issue of mana, it's a fascinating story precisely because trying to figure out exactly what it was is the big mystery. Now, what we do know from the Bible is, that when Moses and the Israelites were passing through the desert and food was dwindling, water was dwindling, and, they were sort of getting perilously close to death, as you would, just walking, through the desert. Well, just at the right time, there was this sort of huge booming voice coming from the sky, and specifically coming from what was described as a cloud. Now, whether it was a cloud, some people might say it was a UFO, but it was something in the sky, and you had this booming voice coming from it. So, was it the voice of God in the cloud, or was it an extraterrestrial using some sort of loud, sound broadcast type technology in a UFO? Now, whatever the answer is, the manna was essentially just dropped and scattered from the sky, and it was basically described as looking like flakes that resembled frost. If you used to go out in the yard in the winter and you see frost, it was kind of like that, but sort of a cross with like a flaky type substance. And now, of course, if you were to live on, if you think of flakes, if you think of like a breakfast cereal, if you just lived on dry breakfast cereal for 40 years, you probably would stay alive, but you'd probably have a lot of issues where your body would be massively lacking in various vitamins and minerals, and you might end up with anemia and things like that. But whatever this substance was, they could live on that with no trouble at all, as if it had some way to ensure constant good health. You know, kind of like somebody who lives on nothing but candy. You know, they're destined for diabetes and who knows what else.
Right.
But manna didn't act like that. It was, you know, it was everything to everybody.
And that's the most fascinating thing. And nowhere have I yet to find any further information on it. Like, what was it other than a complete meal, right, or complete sustenance for the human body for everything that it needed? Obviously, to keep people alive for 40 years and in really good health, right? No,
Yeah.
that's just an amazing thing right there. So maybe, just maybe, somebody will uncover that one of these days. Wouldn't that be fun to find out what that really is?
Yeah, and the problem, of course, is that, you know, it's like with a lot of these ancient books from any religion, is that we've only got limited information based on, you know, the people who wrote the original text, or if they were passed down orally and then written over generations. So, you know, we unfortunately do reach the point where we kind of hit that brick door of where we just cannot find any more information on it, you know, because other than the old texts, there is nothing, you know. So whether we'll actually ever know what manna was, you know, that's debatable. But to be honest, you know, the information that's in the public domain right now is pretty much all we've got, you know.
Exactly. So let's talk about, we started talking about the Anunnaki and the theory that some of them could live maybe as much as 200,000 years, right? And we have stories in our Bible and other stories that talks about, like, Methuselah and, let's see, Methuselah, then there was also Gilgamesh, there was a whole bunch of people. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that kind of line as it goes down, because each of them have a unique characteristic about their lifespan, and they're not identical, obviously. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you go back to the Bible, I mean, Adam had a son supposedly named Seth, who lived allegedly to be 130. Excuse me. And it was said that Adam lived for another 800 years after that. And Seth supposedly became a father to Enosh at 105 and lived to in excess of 800. And Seth lived to 912. And then supposedly the longest living human on Earth, Methuselah, supposedly lived to 969. And he reportedly died in the Great Flood. And if he hadn't died, you know, he used to say he wouldn't have gone on forever and a day. So, again, you know, whether you take those stories literally or not, the fact is that if you look at a lot of these early biblical accounts of people living for massive lifespans, like Methuselah, like Seth, like Enosh, they all had a generational lineage back to Adam, who may have been created by the Anunnaki, who understood the secrets behind immortality. You know, so you have this long lifespan, really. And even Noah was, you know, had an extraordinary lifespan. Now, what's particularly interesting about the story of Noah is that one of the books that's left out of the Bible is the Book of Enoch. Now, you wouldn't know this from the Bible, which tells the story of the Great Flood, obviously, and Noah, but the Book of Enoch talks about when Noah was born. And in the Book of Enoch, he doesn't actually sound fully human. His hair is extremely pale, his skin has a sort of pinkish colour, and his eyes are pinky, glowing red. Now, if in a slightly distorted fashion, that almost sounds like someone who's an albino. Right. And for a long time, there have been theories that the Anunnaki were not albinos in the sense that, you know, it's a medical condition for us, but that's how they look naturally. That was their normal appearance, was sort of, you know, pinkish skin, reddish eyes, and white hair. And in the Book of Enoch, that is how Noah is described. When he's born, the family, if you read the Book of Enoch, are terrified by his appearance. He doesn't look human. So when you tie that in and you find that Noah, had an extensive lifespan, his skin was a strange color, his eyes were a strange color, his hair was white, and, when he was born, the family, were just aghast. Whether or not that was left out of the Bible for that reason, but if you read the Book of Enoch, you'll see it all in there. So, again, you can make an interesting case that this is all sort of the work of, early extraterrestrials. And of course, with Noah looking like that, there's a possibility that we're dealing with gene splicing, or possibly even sort of interspecies sex and reproduction, creating half human, half alien hybrids.
Yeah, and and I've always wondered about that too. When I've thought about that, Nick, as far as the albinos, because the albinos that are here today on this planet, they consider it a medical disorder in some sense. A lot of them don't live to be very old, and it really is kind of an interesting whole concept that maybe that Noah might have been fashioned, and that's the word I'm going to use here, after maybe certain cultures in the Anunnaki people, or from another galaxy, or who knows. I mean, right? We don't really know. And because he did have a long lifespan, he was also more equipped, or better equipped, to handle the environment here on this planet. And through the years, of course, through all the, millennia that's passed since then, it would seem that maybe some of that natural ability for at least a regular lifespan may have been kind of dwindled, or, taken away. It's just an idea, because it's very different. Noah is being very different than if he was more albino-like, than the albinos that we currently have on the planet, as far as a lot of different things.
That's an interesting possibility, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought maybe there's something to that. So we've also, we've talked about a little bit about the gold, and we've talked a little bit about, the mana. There's also some other things in there about, you talked about it in the beginning, about ambrosia, and different cultures. You talked a little bit about in India and stuff like that. Maybe you could share with the audience, some of the different cultures that have had, famous, beings that we'll be familiar with, that had exceedingly long lives, and whatever information may come along with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, if we go to sort of India, as I said earlier, they have their own equivalents of some of these, strange cocktails, if you like, sort of like manna, ambrosia, white powder gold. And for India, it was known as Amrita. Now, basically, the idea, or the scenario, is extremely similar to what we hear and see from ancient Greece, and with the white powder gold, where a substance is sort of alchemically altered, and then it has to be ingested. Now, it's also known as soma, and it was a mysterious liquid. If you look at manna, that was, as I said, like a flaky, frosty type thing. But Amrita was a liquid, and it very much ties in with the stories of the ancient Indian gods, the devas. Deva basically is a translation for divine or heavenly, and it's where the word we use today, diva. Somebody's a diva. That's actually where it comes from. And if you look at the stories of coming out of ancient India, of the gods, kind of like on Earth in the Bible, where you have the god, you have the devil. And you have demons, and you have different hierarchies of demons and supernatural beings, and a heaven and a hell. Well, the Indian stories are, very much the same. You have the devas versus the asuras, and the asuras were sort of clearly the Hindu equivalent of the demons of the Christian Bible. And so you have a lot of similarities here. But when we look into it, as I said, what we find is that the Devas and the Asuras all had something that the human race in India didn't have, and that was these, again, lengthy lifespans. And so, the big question is, what exactly was it? Now, one of the theories about Amrita is that it's actually a mysterious substance which flows from the human pituitary gland. And now the pituitary gland actually ties in with a lot of paranormal activity. That's, in other words, it's sort of like a semi-latent gland that if we could understand it fully and utilize it, it might actually massively increase our psychic abilities. And one of the theories is that the pituitary gland actually has the ability, when accessed properly, to create this particular substance which can allow for rejuvenation of the human body and to keep it sort of well and prevent it from degrading. And but you can find stories concerning Amrita going back, many, many years, literally millennia. One of the first stories in which you see pop up in India is regard to a King Menander who reigned in northern India from 155 to 130 BC. And he, in their ancient texts, which, we still have today, he was trying to find out what this particular nectar was, if you like, and he referred to it as the nectar of the Buddha, the Blessed One. So again, there was this sort of race, if you like, to try and uncover the secrets of what it was that the Devas and the Asuras, what their secret was and why we didn't share it. And but it's interesting in some of the areas of the planet, of India, where you had these gods, the Devas, the Asuras, and et cetera, where you had these entities. This is some of the areas where also we get these legends of ancient nuclear war, which sound like highly advanced aircraft fighting in the sky and unleashing nuclear weapons and flattening cities. If you read the Mahabharata, this ancient epic text, and you see the parallels, and then you put it together with the immortal gods of India, you see something that parallels what was going on in Mesopotamia, and also with the Bible, in terms of having its own potential nuclear war with Sodom and Gomorrah. So, in other words, even though these people did not sort of ever see each other, the stories from India, almost identical apart from the names with what we find in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, I found that to be real fascinating, is to see correlations across the globe in different categories, this one being one of them as well. You're like, I think we're talking about the same thing, but just from a different culture. So it means most of it had to have been at least semi-global, if not totally global. We just don't have all the stories from everywhere. So fascinating, though.
Yeah, go on.
No, that was it.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, when you look at the fact that, there are numerous languages around the planet, it sort of all but demonstrates that and proves that there are going to be different names, for different gods, depending on the cultures. For one person it may be this, for another religion it's that, for another culture it's this. Even in our world today, even in the English language there are differences. I've had a lot of fun telling people that, like in England, the trunk of the car is the boot and the hood is the bonnet, and we both speak English, but the words are totally different. People will say, what's the bonnet, or what's the boot? I'll say, well, the boot's the trunk. So, if you go back thousands of years and cultures where there was no internet, no phone, no TV, nothing, then, you can easily see how different legends and different titles for these things would develop. Not everybody obviously would call them the Anunnaki.
Yeah, see, that was another thing. It's like, I wonder if they called them something else in a different, in a different culture, because there's a lot of them. You talk about, well, first of all, we're talking about the immortality of the gods is what we're talking about. So we've got the everlasting life of those in ancient Egypt, and we've got Ireland, and we've got, there's some other ones that there was some, I don't know if it was, Japan or China, but there was also some over in the Asian world as well that had, gods or deities, whatever it was that they called them, that had extremely long life
Well, yeah,
cycles.
I mean, if you look at, for example, you've got, if you look at, for example, the ancient Greek gods, they were known as the Olympians, and, they lived on Mount Olympus, and, they had their own equivalents, which was known as ambrosia. And, thank you. And ambrosia, was also reputed to not just provide immortality, but also rejuvenation. And funnily enough, a lot of people don't realise this, but the story of Achilles, the story of Achilles' heel, everybody, people say, somebody's got an Achilles' heel. Well, where that actually comes from is that in the ancient Greek mythology, you had this character, Achilles, and his mother, who was one of the gods, would bathe him in ambrosia every day to keep him young and healthy. But when she would dangle him into the ambrosia by the ankle, so his entire body would be covered by ambrosia apart from his ankle. That was his one vulnerable spot, in other words, because her wrist would be around the ankle, and so it never got wet. And so the story is that when he went into battle years later, and the arrow hit him in the ankle, he died because it was his one weak spot. So that's where that legend comes from. It all derives from the idea that ambrosia, if you bathe in it as the gods did, that you would have eternal youth and eternal life. And Achilles, because of the blunder with his ankle always being covered up when his mother dangled him in the water, in the ambrosia as a child, as I said, led to his one weak part of his body.
Yeah, the Achilles heel. Yep, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about, is it Menonomic gold?
Yeah, that is basically like an upgraded version of the idea of white powder gold that was being addressed in the distant past, and which the Anunnaki reputedly required to sort of to stay vital, etc. But we actually find that in the modern era that research is now being done using gold actually to combat cancer, as strange as that might sound. But it's actually something that's being actively dug into right now. It's sort of excuse me. It's kind of convoluted and sort of difficult to explain, but I'll try and sort of just sum it all up for you, what it actually is. Basically, it involves injecting small spheres wrapped in gold into an area where cancer has, established itself. And what happens is that when these small spheres wrapped in gold exit the bloodstream, what they do, they then sort of focus all their attention on the cancerous tumor. And what happens is that infrared light blasts the tumor that allows the gold's nanoparticles to change the light into heat, and it's the heat that destroys the tumor. So, in other words, and this isn't theoretical. This is actually being studies have actually been done in this field on people, and they've had a lot of success. So, this is something that's still in its infancy from our perspective, in terms of using these sort of small spheres wrapped in gold and then changing light to heat and blasting the tumor. But it works. So, in other words, if we could find potentially other means and ways of using gold in the way that apparently the Anunnaki did, thousands and thousands of years ago, we could possibly achieve something similar. And maybe that's exactly what we're doing right now, that we're sort of, following in their footpaths, but unknowingly. But what's interesting is that using gold in these procedures today, it's been shown that when it's used in conjunction with regular therapies like chemotherapy, it's actually, on average, 17 times more successful than if just chemotherapy or radiotherapy is used. You introduce the gold angle, and your chances of beating it are 17 times greater. So, there's clearly something going on. And this relates to also something known as orbitally rearranged monoatomic element, which is a bit of a mouthful. But it goes back actually a few years. But again, it also focused on sort of alchemically altering the structure of gold, and then finding the elusive part of it, that when, again, alchemically altered, can be used as a form of sustenance, or to cleanse the body, or to damage, clean up damage to the body as well.
A few years ago, Nick, it's been quite a few years ago, there was a big surge in this, where they were kind of touting it as an alternative thing, and it was supposed to, again, help rejuvenate the body, very similar to, not really give you immortality, but, it's supposed to help the cells regenerate and all of that stuff. But for the most part, I think what's happened here is that we've probably are missing some important information, because it's not actually doing that, yet.
No, it's not. No.
Yeah. But
you're right. I should clarify that. The work that's being done in relation to cancer cells is working. There's no doubt about that. But it's not. It's being. It's the process of using gold in a different way to, like I said, to turn light into heat is the way it works. But the idea that there could be other properties within gold itself that could potentially provide other previously unforeseen benefits, that's an important thing. And of course, there's the fact that for ancient man, gold was perceived as an extremely valuable metal. And the big question, of course, is why? Somebody might say, well, it's nice and bright and shiny, but there's actually no real consensus as to why the ancients saw gold as being so incredibly valuable to them. It just was. So you could make a case again that the ancients knew something about the traditional legends, if you like, of gold having some sort of magical property attached to it that led to that, rather than we look at it today, it's expensive just because it's gold. Nobody actually thinks, well, why is gold expensive and tin isn't? That's just how it is.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you. I mean, my whole thing is that I think that if we had some additional information, I'm sure there's somebody out there, I'm sure there's quite a few people out there that are testing different applications for it. Oh my goodness, that hour just went by fast, Nick. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to take a short break. Please stay tuned. More of Nick Redfern right here on Journeys with Rebecca. Stay with us. All right, everyone. Welcome back. We are now going into the second hour. You're listening to Journeys with Rebecca. My wonderful, fabulous guest is Nick Redfern. A couple of quick announcements before I forget. Next week's show, which would be on next Monday, is September 4th. It is a holiday here in the United States. We will be replaying a show for you, and then I will return the following week, and we'll be updating my newsletter for everyone and guest list, et cetera, and so forth before that time comes. So look for that. And again, you can get to that on my website. That's journeyswithrebecca.com. And a reminder for everyone, if you have questions of my fantastic guest tonight, please place your questions in the chat room in all capital letters. And welcome back, Nick.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca.
I have a question here for you. This is from Tobias, and he wonders if you have ever come across any information relating to the suggestion that the Anunnaki were created by a group of humanity, perhaps evolved humanity, that maybe they were created by what, were evolved humans, and they are one step down below those who created us, whatever, right? So, have you ever heard anything like that?
Well, there are theories that, one theory for the Anunnaki, which is an interesting one, is that they weren't extraterrestrials, but they were an even earlier form of human, far more advanced one that maybe, were perceived as gods. That, if you look back thousands of years, where at the same time when the Egyptians were building the pyramids, in northern Europe, you had people still living in caves, So in the early years of human civilization, there was a great deal of difference between, the technological advances of different people in some areas versus no technological advances in another area. So this has been sort of given the idea of what's become known as the crypto-terrestrial theory, which was coined by the late Matt Tonis, who wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials, which is a really good book, and it delves into the idea of what if these all-powerful aliens actually weren't alien, but they were like a higher form of human, which realized that the people who are less advanced, so to speak, perceived them as gods, and they were happy to be seen as gods, So there is that angle to it also.
Yeah, let's talk about the Bible. It said that we were created in the image of man, human. Mm-hmm. So I've always looked at that and thought, well, if we were created in that image, then surely they must be us and we must be them, right? Obviously they're more advanced. They come from different planets, different eras, different galaxies. We don't exactly know where they come from, in different dimensions. But yeah, it would stand to reason. Yes, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not impossible, that there weren't, civilizations on the planet that came before us, whether extraterrestrial, human, or a combination of the two, there could well have been people before us. You look, as I said, with ancient nuclear warfare, people often point to the idea that it was the gods or, it was, the aliens, in other words. But, maybe there were people like us before us. You don't have to look at the state of the world now, all this talk of nuclear war and whatever. People today a lot of people think a nuclear war is winnable. It's not. People say, well, there's no more Soviet Union, etc., etc. Well, it doesn't matter. Each side has got literally thousands of nukes. And to put it in perspective, some of the nuclear weapons that we have and they have today are 70 times more powerful than the ones that were dropped on Japan in 1945. Now, if you look at those, they obliterated the two cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you imagine today, they're 70 times more powerful than those. And you've got thousands of them. You don't need tens of thousands to wipe out the enemy. Actually a couple of hundred will do it. So, if we ever went to a nuclear war, no one would win because nobody could win. And 10,000 years from now, there'll be rumors of this mighty race of people that once flew in the sky and had strange things that would take them across the water, and they could speak to people by putting this little thing against their ear. And people would say, well, that's just nonsense. They'd say, that's nonsense. We're the first, that's just folklore. In the same way we say things like the destruction of Atlantis is folklore. Maybe it wasn't, it may not have been called Atlantis, but there could have been, a race of people like us that did exactly what we might do one day, and, and we go the same way as them, because, there literally is no way to win a war, all this nonsense about hiding under the desk or hiding under the bed, I know a lot about this. I live like 35 miles from downtown Dallas. I can tell you that if one of the average size bombs, was targeted at Dallas and hit Dallas square on, I live 35 miles away, and I would have like second-degree burns. So you imagine what that's 35 miles away from the blast. You're still getting second-degree burns. You imagine what it would be.
Right.
You know, the entire city would be vaporized, and literally vaporized. There'd be nothing left. You know, like 4 million dead and no bones, no clothes, wreckage of cars. In the immediate blast zone today of the most powerful bombs, everything is literally vaporized for miles and miles.
Yeah,
which is a bit bleak, and it's all the more reason to try and ensure we don't do it. But if we did, then you could easily see why, you know, the legends of sort of fantastic beings once existed. You could easily see how that could develop, you know, if a civilization wipes itself out overnight.
Yeah, listen, are you moving around at all where you're at?
No.
Because the signal's getting a little garbled.
Yeah, actually, I can hear it's a bit distorted at your end. I can hear it sort of breaking up a bit.
Okay, so, well, maybe it'll straighten out here. You know, these
maybe
things
it's the weather. I mean, it's not raining right now, but we have had storms. Well, not so much storms, but we've had a lot of rain through the day.
And it could very well be. I mean, you know, we're living in very strange times, Nick, in my opinion. It's not normal. It's the new normal, whatever that means, right? Oh, we can't define that word. Okay, so let's get back to immortality. You know, one of the things that I realized when I picked up your book, Nick, was, you know, through the years, through the ages, through, you know, for the time of times, we have always, there's always been this focus, not the only focus, but a focus on, extending life, immortality, the fountain of youth, and, you know, all of that, right? The tree of life. I mean, there's just all these references throughout all of our known history, and God only knows what's in our unknown history that we haven't uncovered or we may not ever get to. It may just actually not even be there anymore. But there's always been this focus on immortality or extended life or, you know, the quality of life, for sure. I mean, it's a big part of, our existence, truly. Especially when you get to be older and you start looking back and you start thinking of your own mortality. You see a lot of people that do a lot of very interesting things to try to extend their life. Some is good things and some is not so good, as we've seen. But it seems to be, quite a big thing. And I do know that, we've extended our life cycle. I think it was 72 years for a female and 68 years for a male, like last century, and now we're up to like 76 and 72 or something like that as an average. I mean, so life is, you know, there has been somewhat of an extension, you know, by a few years of life.
Yeah,
and I think
there's no doubt about that.
This.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that we've managed to extend our lifespans, and actually the two nations where they have, you know, they're really healthy and live extensive lifespans, sort of like well into late 80s. One is the Eskimos, because they just live on fish. You know, they don't live on, you know, rubbish like we do. You know, and the other one are the Japanese. They have one of the highest lifespans, again, because, you know, their food is sort of, you know, it's not based around sort of fat and carbs and, you know, cheese and all that good stuff. And so, you know, there's no doubt that has an effect. And one of the interesting but kind of disturbing trends is that, you know, studies have been undertaken which show that, yes, the lifespan is growing, but the number of kids who are now in their teens and sometimes in their pre-teens, the figures for diabetes are rising massively in young children. And they're actually said, according to the studies, that in the near future, unless things change, we'll peak. And then with the ill health and everything else concerned around like diabetes, that the figure will actually start to lower itself again, you know, instead of keep going on and on a few years it'll start to degrade and go back to 75 and 72 or 69 or whatever, purely and simply because we don't have a full picture of how today's kids, with massive percentages being diabetic, we're not sure what things are going to be like when they're 75, how many of them will reach 75 because of going down with this or that at those ages. When me and you were kids, you were running around playing all the time and burning everything off, Kids don't do that anymore. So, you can look at it like that. But I think, the main reason why people are looking for longevity is because when you sort of become consciously aware as a kid, everybody realizes that we're on a time limit, and whether you believe in an afterlife or not, everybody wants to cling on to this life. Now, there's no doubt that in terms of, eating healthy and not drinking and or whatever, we do know for sure that even that, will only take you so far. You're not, if you give up drinking beer, you're not going to live to 200, which is why I'm not giving up beer. So, but joking aside, you can do certain amount of good things to help your body, but there's only so much. Now, we know why there is an upper limit, but we can't do anything about it. It's called the Hayflick limit. And basically, what it explains in very simple terms is that human cells can only replicate and divide on average between 40 to 60 times before they don't divide anymore. And then of course when you're at your peak, you're a young child and in your teens, your body is at its peak, and so your cells replicate and divide through this process in a very sort of healthy and robust way. But when you reach that 40 to 60 period, I don't mean 40 to 60 years, it's the period, the times that the cells can divide. After you've reached roughly 60 dividing periods, then the cells start to break down because they're not replicated. Now, and we know that's why we age, if we could find how to ensure that those cells kept naturally replicating, then there's no reason why we couldn't, massively extend our lifespans to where you could be 150, 160, and when you're 160, you could look perhaps 85, or maybe when you're 85, you would look 45. But that's actually not fantasy. That is fact. If we could figure out how to break the code of what's called the Hayflick limit, and the big irony is, this has been going on not just for years but thousands of years. I mean, one person we kind of very, very briefly touched upon earlier was Gilgamesh, King Gilgamesh, who ruled over an area called Uruk, which today is part of Iraq. And his story goes back 4,000 BC. So we're talking about 6,000 years ago, and his story is told in what's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he was this sort of mighty, renowned Sumerian king who, as I said, ruled over Uruk in ancient Sumer. And there's a good chance that he was sort of part Anunnaki, because although he certainly didn't have everlasting life, he was said to have ruled over Uruk for 130 years. And we don't know how old he was when he came to power. If he was 30, he could have lived to be 160. But he was said to have been not only obsessed with trying to find a cure for death, or to keep death away, but he was also reportedly very tall, possibly somewhere close to 12 to 14 feet tall, which suggests that he had Anunnaki blood in him, because they were described as giants as well. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he talks about how he went on this sort of worldwide quest to try and find what he described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's described not as a liquid or a cocktail, but a mysterious plant that could only be found at the bottom of the ocean, which had rejuvenating powers. So again, we have sort of another spin, another version, but also which revolves around having to take in a strange, mysterious substance to ensure longevity. And unfortunately, immortality was taken away from him at the last moment, and he didn't have chance to ingest this substance. And he finally gave up then and realized that he wasn't going to be immortal after all, and just did what the rest of us do. You try not to think about it and enjoy your life while you're here. So. But the story of Gilgamesh, also then runs into something else you were talking about at the beginning. The idea of, was there a second agenda involved in the Iraq war when the invasion in 2003 went ahead? Because it's interesting to note that in the immediate years leading up to the war of Iraq, there were rumors that the final resting place of Gilgamesh had been found in Iraq, in what used to be Uruk. And there were rumors of advanced technologies having been found and ancient manuscripts that might have detailed the key to immortality. Now, at least some of these discoveries made their way to the Museum of Iraq, which is based in Baghdad. Now, when the invasion occurred, the museum itself was looted, which people might not find surprising, with all the chaos and anarchy going on. But when the U.S. military went in and helped to, figure out what was missing and what was still around and what was still in good, in a good state of not being damaged or whatever, they actually found that literally thousands of items were missing. And what was interesting was that the U.S. Army team that oversaw this concluded that it was made to look like some kind of haphazard, anarchic attack on the museum and, looting, basically. But they conclude that in reality, it was made to look like that, and whoever had gone in there clearly knew their way around the museum and targeted certain areas where some of the more intriguing and hidden items were held. And the theory is that some sort of powerful, almost like a secret order, if you like, a secret society, that kind of thing, looking for the secret of immortality, went in there with the hope of trying to find the secrets that were hidden in the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh and other ancient texts, and possibly even find the technology, the ancient technology, and, smuggle that back to wherever and use it to create like an immortal elite that would rule over the planet. So, this whole angle gets into sort of conspiracy-filled areas as well.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that was a bunch right there. So let me share this with you. I don't know if you heard this, but there was a few years back, quite a few years. There's been different stories through the years where, these wonderful finds have been kind of known, like, oh, we think we have found this, or we think we have found that, whatever this site was, some ancient site that has, all this great information. Then all of a sudden you hear either A, nothing about it, or B, well, it was robbed, tomb raiders came in, or robbers came in, or, whatever the case would be. Now all of a sudden, this great find is no longer available. It's either not available to the public, or the military has taken it over. And it depends on whose military you're talking about. It could be the United States military, it could be the country's military, or both in conjunction, or it has been taken away maybe by what you're saying as a secret society. And these are all of these wonderful pieces of information that still hasn't come to light. But I get this feeling, Nick, and I don't know if anybody else out there does, but I get this feeling that soon, and I still think it's going to be in my life cycle, that some of this information that was taken from humanity is going to be then shared with humanity on some level. This knowledge. Somebody's going to find out about it, whether it be a secret society or whether it's some scientific research and development places or whatever the case may be. I just think that some of this stuff is going to come to light.
Well, it may do. I mean, certainly, we've got strands of the story in the public domain. I mean, we know that, like, for example, with the Museum of Baghdad, that was deliberately targeted for certain artifacts. We know that this tied in time-wise with these, like a year or two before, findings that were said to be connected to Gilgamesh and reports of giant statues being found and all sorts of weird stuff. So, we only need to get a few more threads together, so to speak, that might sort of allow us to put more of the picture together. But of course, the big question is, if somebody is actively looking for the answers to what Gilgamesh was looking for, and Amrita and Ambrosia and all these things, the big question, of course, is if it's like a global elite, are they going to prevent the rest of us from having it, and it's just going to be available to, the people with the power?
Yeah, well, let's hope that turns the table.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's a whole nother thing. And it does, you're right, though. It does, some of this gets into the whole conspiracy thing. And I'm not so sure that we're still not looking at conspiracy things when it comes to, as we were talking about the gold, because I've read some, scientific, papers on some of the applications of gold for health reasons, and cancer was one of them, and there was some others, and of course, and it was all applied to nanotechnology, and yeah, so, there's lots of stuff coming up here. So, we live in a really interesting time, that's for sure, where we're going to see humanity take a different turn, and hopefully it'll be a better one than where it's been. Let's talk a little bit, Nick, about, you mentioned the man who never dies, the immortal in the Pentagon, and Seeking the Secrets of Eternal Youth. These are all titles of 3 chapters there. So I'm going to kind of let you spin those however you want, as far as picking it up and maybe sharing a little bit of information about any or all of the above.
Yeah, well, one of them is this strange character. The story first surfaced round about the turn of the 1960s in a book written by a guy named Frank Stranges, who was in the UFO field at the time. He's long dead now. But Frank Stranges wrote a book called A Stranger at the Pentagon, and it dealt with this guy named Valiant Thor, who allegedly was an extremely human-looking alien who was part of a team that had reportedly, allegedly, however you want to put it, infiltrated the U.S. government and also other governments. Now, the term infiltrate kind of sounds sinister, but according to the story, it was more of sort of a benevolent infiltration to try and curb our warlike ways and prevent us from destroying ourselves. And what would be the best way to do that would be to subtly find a way into the governments of the most powerful nations and just try and gently push them in the right direction. Now, there are a lot of stories like that from the 1950s. The people who had these experiences were known as the contactees, and the aliens were known as the Space Brothers. And there were people like George Van Tassel, Truman Bethurum, Orfeo Angelucci, George Hunt Williamson. They were some of the more well-known of the contactees, and of course George Adamski. But the story of Valiant Thor is sort of very similar in that respect. Now, the reason why I include that in the book is because over the years, a number of people have claimed to have met this character, Valiant Thor, which was the name he used reportedly, when speaking in human terms. But a number of people claim to have met him in the 1980s and 90s, and one of the cases I talk about in the book, not too long ago at all, just a few years, they've all claimed that when they've seen pictures of him, or the couple of pictures that exist, but from back in the 50s, he looks exactly the same, except for 2 things. His hairstyle's different, which, is probably obvious, and his clothing is different, which will be obvious too. But they've said, other than that, his face looks identical, as if he looked about 35 back in the 50s, and he looks about 35 now. So, in that sense, or, you could make a case that could he have been, one of these long-lived extraterrestrials, or, could he have been a human who had stumbled on or knew the secrets of how to ensure immortality, and, perhaps he was part of some secret group, some select society, or an extraterrestrial. We don't really know, but there are a few cases like that. I mean, for example, probably the other most famous one, which I also talk about, and which also, has a lot of these same strands attached to it, is a man that became known as the Count of Saint Germain. And he first surfaced round about 1705, so we're talking about the earliest years of the 18th century. And he soon kind of networked with everybody who was, powerful and rich and influential across Europe. And he was a mysterious character who looked to be, like Valiant Thor, in his 30s, and who never seemed to change. And he had a lot of influence with European royalty and high society figures at that particular time. Now, excuse me, what's particularly interesting is that in the story of the Count of Saint Germain, nobody ever saw him eat. All they ever saw him take in was what he described as a form of tea. And so, in other words, whatever this tea was, it was clearly one of these mysterious liquids, or the very same liquid as all the rest of them, but just with a different name. So, in other words, we're talking about something, again, akin to ambrosia, to amrita, to the nectar of the gods, to all of these things. And, you have to wonder, if it was just a story, why would it have the same key ingredients? A man who never ages, and also who never eats, but has to keep drinking this strange liquid. So, the Count of Saint Germain is one that's endured for a long time, and people have said that over the years, to kind of hide his tracks, he sort of faked, or had paid people off to provide a death certificate and then a new birth certificate under another name, and then he'll keep resurfacing in different parts of the world with different identities to keep one step ahead of people.
That's actually been a topic of a couple of movies. Of course, they would call it sci-fi fantasy, about people who are really immortal in some sense of the word, and that's what they do throughout history.
Well, yeah, there's actually a really good movie came out in 2015. It's not like a sci-fi movie; it's more like a drama about a woman who she wants to fall in love, but she can't because she knows that her husband or boyfriend's eventually going to die as an old man, and she'll be young. It's called the Age of Adeline. And it stars Blake Lively and Harrison Ford, and it's actually just through an accident that she becomes immortal, and you find that she has to change her identity, and although you would imagine living forever is great, she lives in like a state of just depression because, like I said, everybody around her ages and dies. And she can't be seen hanging around with people too much because she worries the government's going to try and get their hands on her and figure out, how she can live and the rest of us can't. So, it's kind of a really cool, thought-provoking movie, The Age of Adeline. And
oh, yeah.
And it kind of, when you watch it, it's sort of probably if everybody didn't have immortality, you were the only one, you would come to realize how difficult your life would be, being hunted down because other people just want to know how you live and why can't they have it, and, watching you. There's one bit in the film where the character Adeline's talking to her mother, and Adeline's like 25. You think it's her mother, but it's actually a daughter, and her daughter looks like 85 or something, which, is sort of really weird, but that's how it could be, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember, I didn't get to see all the movie, but I do remember watching parts of it. So yeah, I'm going to have to sit down and watch that. Good movie. So let's talk a little bit about, we're about 20 minutes or so out, 25 minutes. We talked a little bit about Valiant Thor, and I have to let you know is that I've had a gentleman on the show. His name's Craig Campabasso. Which he has done a little short flick, called Stranger at the Pentagon. He works out of, California, and, he knew, Frank Stranges, and his information was passed on to him, from Frank, and, so, Valiant Thor was a fantastic story that he talked to us about. I was really glad to see it here in your book. I was like, oh yeah, somebody else knows about him too. It's kind of cool.
People still, as I said, people still, report sightings or encounters to this day. So it's very much an ongoing thing, really. But I mean, there are other ways in which sort of immortality is being addressed now, not just slowing or stopping the aging process, but things like cloning and uploading our consciousnesses to the internet, which wouldn't be much fun, but different alternative ways. So it may not be all reliant in the future on the idea of just finding a cure and you just suddenly stop aging at 25 or 35 or whatever age you choose. There could be other ways and means around it as well.
Exactly. So the next couple things that I'd like to talk to you about is, these are your next two chapters, Containers of Souls and The Greys Desperately Seeking Souls, because we're talking about souls. So maybe you can bring those two pieces into all of this with the immortality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, again, demonstrating how similar so many different religions are. There's despite all the infighting and terrorism and everything else, the big irony is that when you get down to the core of it all, most religions kind of believe the same thing, namely that there was a creator of some sort, whatever they call it, and that there's some sort of afterlife and multiple potential realms where you might go. That is the big irony. Most religions believe that, but we still keep fighting, just over names and titles and whatever. But the interesting thing is, that one thing that sort of runs through most of these religions is the idea that the physical body only amounts to part of what we are, and then we have what you call the soul or the life force, and when you talk about things like souls and life forms and whatever they might be, it's sort of a difficult concept for some people to understand. If the soul survives, do we look like we did at death, or can we choose how we look, or how do people perceive us? A lot of questions. But what's interesting, and this is why I talk about this in the book, is that a lot of alien abductees talk about not just being sort of kidnapped and taking on board UFOs and subjected to medical experiments, but they've talked about the so-called greys, these little aliens with the big black eyes and the large heads, actually extracting the human soul from the body, separating the two, as if they had a science or a technology that can do it. And one of the theories that's been put forward is that the greys are sort of definitively soulless, and they are sort of, on this almost obsessive agenda to try and figure out what the human soul is, and by hybridizing themselves with us, with these abduction experiments and reproductive experiments, etc., they create more and more alien human hybrids and refine them more and more. Would they one day be able to have a soul and not just wink out when their time's up? And one of the people who's dug into this more than any other is somebody I mentioned in the book, Nigel Kerner, who's written a couple of good books on the idea of the human soul, being contained within the body, and that it's the container, if you like, that it protects the soul. So from the aliens' perspective, the soul part of us is the most important one because they want to try and replicate it.
Yeah, I've actually heard that story before, not quite as succinctly as you wrote it in the book, but, that whole idea, especially when you were explaining it again about, the Greys could potentially or possibly have the technology to separate the soul from the vehicle or the physical form is just, it just absolutely, I don't know what it does. It just makes me feel very, very, it's like, oh my God, that's just beyond inhuman. It's just,
well,
ew.
It does have its it does have its sort of parallel in science fiction. I mean, if you look at the whole idea of, the Greys coming here and we're doing all this for your benefit, that's what we're told. Well, maybe it isn't, maybe that they don't want to kill us because obviously we haven't been killed. We might be like a commodity to them. We might be like the cattle, whereas, cattle, for people who eat meat, that's their food. But if you're, with us, it might be we're sort of like soul cattle, that we're being reaped of our souls, or they're trying to do that, trying to achieve the reaping of our souls, to replicate it somehow or use it to their benefit and their advantage. Now, it kind of has its parallel, this idea of recycling and manipulating human souls into new minds and new bodies. It's kind of like in the Matrix movies, when we're living in this dream world and we're not actually seeing the bigger picture of what's going on around us. In the Matrix, everybody thinks what we believe to be the real world is a dream world, and it's just one long dream, or like a sophisticated computer program called the Matrix. And reality is that we're all sort of lined up in these pods, providing energy for the machines. And it's kind of like that, the theory being that we're not seeing the full picture of what's going on here, that, there's this sort of battle on for our souls. And maybe that's where the legends, the ancient religious texts come from, the idea of, it's the human soul that demons and angels are battling for. Well, maybe they are battling for the souls, not to take them to heaven or hell, but to allow them to make use of the souls to ensure that they have immortality themselves, refine them, as I said, a little bit more and more each time. So, but when you go down that path, a lot of people I've spoken to find that really disturbing, the idea that we could be, somebody's cattle and it's our souls that are being manipulated as a form of extending the life of something else from out there.
Huh. Well, based on what you just said, theoretically speaking, right, that we could say that reincarnation then was just an exchange of, they were kind of recycling the soul and kind of trying to do different things. So each time they're going to grab a different body and put it in there, this soul, right, so to speak, and it's going to be like building the layer of the cake so that they get this quote unquote soul maybe grown. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in Whitley Strieber's Communion book, he actually says that the entities that he met, he doesn't call them aliens because he's just not sure what they are. He refers to them as visitors. But he said that he was told that they actually told him, quote, "We recycle human souls." Now, one of the real big ironies of all this is that if you go back to the very earliest stories and legends of the human race having souls, in numerous cultures, they talk about how the soul, when it's sort of recycled, it doesn't remember the previous life, which is like, the ultimate bitter irony, in the sense that every single one of us might have immortality, but the problem is, if we don't remember the previous existence, you're never going to know you had immortality. So, that's one of the things that would be, kind of cruel if we've all lived multiple times, and we really have lived for hundreds of thousands of years, but our memory is wiped clean, the slate's wiped clean every time we die, and what you inherit into the new soul is the traits of your character rather than the actual memories, and there is some evidence for that, you hear these stories which have been validated. Somebody has, a heart transplant, and then within weeks they start to get food cravings from the person whose heart they were given, as if they kind of inherited a characteristic trait from that person. There are a lot of cases like that, and even where there was a famous one where somebody had an organ transplant and from somebody who committed suicide, and then that person unknowingly fell into a state of depression and also killed themselves. Again, as if, this part of the original person becomes imprinted on you, even though it's not the memories, but it's still part of you.
Well, when that speak to like the idea of the DNA is actually a memory bank as well as a source
Yeah.
of information. Yeah.
And it might explain things like, why is it when somebody's born, within a couple of years, they really want to learn to play the piano or play tennis, or they suddenly become a really, brilliant scientist. Maybe it is because they're inheriting the traits, not the memories, but, the characteristic of the person before. In the same way that somebody who loves dogs in this life is going to love dogs in the next life. Somebody who's a racist in this life may be destined to be a racist in the next life because it's the imprint, that kind of thing. That's not defending racists. It's just, but it's pointing out the idea that there are certain characteristics that are inbuilt in us in different ways, that could allow for, different aspects of a character to develop. So it gets into lots of controversial areas as well.
Yeah, it does. And it gets into a lot of theoretical and, as you said,
well,
controversial.
Yeah, most of this is theoretical. We're just really at the fringe of it still,
I just love it though, because the fact that we're just sitting here having this discussion and we're talking about the possibility of any of this is just really a fabulous thing to do, because what it does is it allows you to take a look at your own belief systems and, do your own research and really sense and feel how things really could be. It's just about walking down a path that says, hey, this is a possibility. It's a potential. And it's not meant to be a negative at all. This immortality thing is quite a fascinating topic when you stop and think about everything that people do. I mean, people strive to live longer, to look younger, longer, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, we have this thing, right? I mean, we have this thing about humans. We do, many, not everybody, but many people do. Matter of fact, most people do.
I think the reason why we do that and other animals don't. I mean, we know that some animals do have a concept of death. They understand like elephants, they mourn. And they lay like not branches, but they leave like leaves and things like that, and pull off bits of bushes and put them over the body of a dead elephant. They know what's happened, and other animals do as well. They mourn, and I think we don't often give animals the the credit that they deserve. They're not dumb creatures for us to use, and whatever. They're living creatures that have as much right to the planet as we do. But, so far as we know, they don't necessarily have a full concept of death in the same way that we do. That we know they mourn and they get upset and they're happy and all that, in the same way we do. But in terms of literal mourning, it's hard to say. But what I would say, is that when you look at situations like this, we do see that there is something in us which is a little bit different. We are acutely aware from as soon as we are aware of anything that we're on a time limit. Your pet dog loves running around the yard all day long, but probably doesn't have a concept or think about one day this is going to end. We do. We're probably the only animal on the planet that consciously thinks about that quite often. And I think that's why we're driven to try and find a stop to it, because people are like, well, it just can't be the end. It's impossible. People cannot face that. But the fact that it's like our intelligence is also our worst enemy, because, we realize the worst thing possible that you can realize, so we try and stop it.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, for sure. For sure, Nick, I do. And yeah, I mean, you put some really good thoughts out there for people to kind of mull over and, extend. And I want to remind everyone, and I want you to remind everyone too, the different places, but this particular book that we're talking about tonight is the third in the trilogy, Immortality of the Gods, Legends, Mysteries, and the Alien Connection to Eternal Life, is available at Amazon.com. And as a published author of over 40 books, you have a lot of your books are on Amazon, but they're also on other places too, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Because I want to give you enough time to get all that information out. But to wrap all of this up in this book, honest to God, Nick, honestly, this was one of my, other than Men in Black is now my second to this book. This is my favorite book of all, I swear. I just couldn't hardly put it down. I read it in just a couple of days. I mean, I was just like, I couldn't put it down. It was great.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was really fun. You have a couple of chapters in here on cloning, living forever, and the science of immortality. Is there anything else? We have probably about, about 5, 6, 7 minutes.
I think cloning's worth sort of mentioning, because of I kind of see it more as the sinister aspect. Well, not so much sinister, but just weird. There's the theory is that one day we might be able to sort of create identical clones of ourselves, and when, we get old and we start to degrade, our memories, everything in our mind could be sort of downloaded into the new clone. Now, I say to me it's weird because we're looking at it from our perspective from today. 300 years from now, it might be just considered totally normal for people. In the same way, 300 years ago, if you said people can have heart transplants and kidney transplants or whatever, people would say, no, that's against the word of God or whatever, you know what I mean? People wouldn't go for that. But maybe it's just the same with us today, that, it's kind of what's known as culture shock, the idea that technology advances too far too quickly. People don't like it. They get kind of intimidated by massive changes in science and technology. So, cloning, I guess, could be interesting, but it could also be kind of, like I said, creepy, making multiple doubles of yourself and having them all lined up for the day you need them, and you just, go into the lab and everything's downloaded out of your mind into the new body, and the old one gets thrown in the furnace or whatever, but again, I mean, who knows what the future will bring? And, it's kind of one of the things I talk about very briefly in the book, is it's not actually touching directly on immortality, but it talks about, the way in which we could reproduce in a different way in the future. Is a lot of research has been done in recent years into creating, for women, artificial wombs, to the point where one day babies won't be born anymore. They'll grow in tanks. Now, of course, I'm sure most mothers would say the same thing, that part of being pregnant, I've obviously never been pregnant, but, the idea that the bonding process, when you're going through that 9-month period, it would be kind of, I'd imagine, cold and calculated to just go along once a week to see the baby growing inside a tank of liquid, So there are increases in science and immortality. It's interesting and we all want it, but there are, some downsides. I mean, of course, if you could live forever, it wouldn't mean you couldn't die. I mean, if you were immortal and you happened to fall off a 300-foot high building, you're still going to die when you hit the floor. Immortality means physically you're going to live forever, but you're still going to be, it's not like if you get shot in the brain that your body's going to miraculously repair itself. No, you'll be dead. So you could find you'll be in a position where people become...
Be gone.
Yeah, but people might fall into this position of now they've got immortality, they want to hang on to it so much that they don't do anything. We live our lives to the best we can because we know we're on a time limit, so we jump out of an airplane, or you jump off a waterfall on vacation. But because we know we want to do everything we can in this period we've got. But if you're living forever and you're frightened to lose that thing, you might find yourself, you become like a strange psychosis where you're frightened to go outside for fear that you're going to lose this gift you've been given. And so people end up doing nothing because they're fearful of losing their immortality, whereas we don't think about it as much. We just get on with it and hope for the best. So, and of course, there's the issue if we've all got immortality and nobody dies, it wouldn't take long at all before the planet reached breaking point in terms of the number of people. Does that mean, you know, the current population, if it's all suddenly immortal, does that mean everybody's then banned from ever having children? Would there never be any more children born because there's no room for them on the planet? You know, there are a lot of big questions like that people don't often think about, you know.
Yeah, and those are really all very valid points. I mean, you know, you stop and think about it. If everyone had, you know, an average, now I'm not saying everyone, but if there's an average of 2 children born to every family, and then those 2 children go on to have 2 children, then, you know, you've got an exponential growth of, you know, generations. Just, it could present some really major problems. Well, we're getting really short on time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say, you know, imagine an entire world of everybody's 35. You know, it might not be strange to them, but to us looking at it in the future, it would be odd, you know, if there was nothing but 35-year-olds on the planet and no old people, no young people, no babies, nothing, just people in between. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no diversity. Everybody would be pretty much close to the same, and some people may have already lived 100 years, some may be 1,000 years, but they all look 35. You don't know who you're talking to. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of drawbacks to it for sure. You know, of course.
But all the drawbacks, but deep down we all want it. You know, that's kind of like the problem.
Isn't that the truth? All right, so I know you have a website. It's nickredfern.com. And then, of course,
that's actually
Amazon.
one of my old ones. I'll give you the new. That one's shut down now. But
okay.
I have a blog which is called World of Whatever. And if people just Google Nick Redfern, the first link they'll actually see is to my blog called World of Whatever, which I update most days, and with, you know, news articles, items, reviews, that sort of thing, and all the books are available on Amazon, and round about 60-70% you can buy off the shelves in Barnes & Noble as well.
Okay, I think I lost you there.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, there you are. You also have some other books on other website though, right? From another publisher that is available?
Yeah, I'm actually with 5 different publishers altogether. The Men in Black one you're talking about, that was done by my agent's company, Lisa Hagen Books. I'm also with Visible Ink Press, and I've got one out in September called Shapeshifters, which is a study of shape-shifting creatures throughout history and folklore and legend, obviously with things like werewolves, but also other shapeshifters, like in Africa you have leopard men cults and things like that. And then, as I said, in January, I've got a full-length book coming out on the Slender Man mystery.
Well, and we're going to invite you back as soon as your next book is out. For the rest of you, I want to thank you so much for being here. Until we meet again, where will your life's journey lead you? Many blessings, everyone. Good night. Thank you, Nick. Good night. Good night, Tobias and JP. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Bye.